Well, we've just had a wonderful and eloquent speech by Charles Handy in favor of corporate social responsibility in its various forms. And Mark has just given us a wonderful and eloquent statement in favor of shared value. Now, who could be against responsibility? Who could be against sharing? And who could be against value? Well, I'm going to have a go. Somebody has to do it. I can understand why there's so much enthusiasm for these sorts of ideas at the moment. We are living through a crisis of capitalism, both in the sense that the system is in a mess, and also in the sense that its legitimacy as a system is being undermined. And I at first was very tempted to dismiss completely out of hand these rather malodorous, drum-beating people in New York. But it does seem to be part of a very general and widespread movement, which we have to take seriously. And the fact that people insist on sitting in circles and beating drums doesn't necessarily mean that they should be ignored. The second thing, and one of the things that's most interesting about what Michael Porter and Mark Kramer are doing, is that we have a situation at the moment in which most of the growth in the world, 3/4 of the growth in the world, is coming from emerging markets. And emerging markets are presenting us with very interesting sets of opportunities and very interesting sets of problems, that the boundaries between the corporation and the world around the corporation are much more fluid in emerging markets, and customers in emerging markets are not just there, they need to be thought about, they need to be invented. So business problems in emerging markets are very different, and so we have to think about what constitutes value in different ways in a world in which growth is concentrated in these places. And the third reason why I would welcome very much what Mark and Michael Porter have been saying is that it adds a certain nuance to the debate, which I think is valuable. This is a debate which has been polarized between the Adam Smith school, who say that the point of human nature is that by pursuing your self-interest, the hidden hand can turn it into a social benefit, and the sort of corporate responsibility people who say, wait a minute, this creates an unequal and greedy society, and managers must be responsible for their own good. We've had that debate for a very long time, and we have in what shared value represents some sort of an attempt at Hegelian synthesis. Now, this can be a bit disappointing in the sense it can all boil down to that appalling phrase about a win-win situation. I often get communications from PR people which include the phrase win-win, which I automatically delete and ignore because it's banal. But there is a sense in which what they're saying in this is that social problems are also business opportunities, that we can pursue our interests as businessmen by solving those problems, that infrastructure problems also business opportunities or ways in which businesses can create networks which ultimately deliver value. So we need to think outside the formal boundaries of the corporation. I think that's absolutely true. And what they also say is that business needs to reconceptualize itself. It needs to think very broadly about what it's about, that you can't have a very narrow sense of what makes for long-term success, the sort of sense that is in a quarterly statement. We need to think more creatively about what makes for business success, and I think that's true particularly in the context of emerging markets. So I agree with all of that. However, I now want to move to the more negative side of what I want to say today. One is, how new is all of this? Is it really advancing thinking very far? We talk about social problems being business opportunities. That's absolutely right. I recently visited South Africa. I visited a fascinating university, which was a combination of a university and a call center. So the people in the university would work in the call center by day, and they would use exactly the same tools that they'd used for the call center to learn and train themselves in the afternoon and the evening. And the argument behind this call center was that in a lot of the emerging world, free education is too expensive. You actually have to have a system which combines work and learning, which combines working in a call center with going to a university so that people can earn and pay. And I think we can see examples of this sort of really creative thinking all around the world going on all the time at the moment. So it's true what they're saying, but is it new? Surely it was always thus. It's always been the case that innovative companies have seen social problems as opportunities and opportunities to rethink the way they do their business. Take something that I am addicted to, which is chocolate. Now, chocolate was, with Cadbury's and Rowntree's, these were all Quakers who were all very concerned that the working classes were drunken degenerates, which of course they were. So they wanted to wean them off all this alcohol. Why didn't they drink cocoa? Why didn't they drink hot chocolate? And they saw in this opportunity to reform the working class, a product which became an extremely successful and indeed an addictive one. So companies have always sought to solve social problems, and they've always used that as a starting point for new products. Ecosystems, the idea that you need to create clusters, absolutely right. That's absolutely right across the emerging markets. But again, it has always been thus. The United States, about 50 years ago, had 3,000 company towns. These were huge ecosystems which companies created simply because they needed to reach outside themselves. They needed to think carefully about what the boundaries of the company were. They didn't have any institutions there. If they were mining companies or chocolate companies, they were just starting up. So they thought very pragmatically, we need to set up a waterworks, we need to set up a police department, we need to set up a school. They did all these things. They created these company towns. They created training systems because they didn't have training. So there is nothing new that has been said here. What we're saying is that businesses are pragmatic organizations. They make profit out of problems. They think very seriously about ecosystems and create ecosystems. It's always been the case. We're simply restating what has always gone on. Secondly, I think a lot of all of this is context dependent. A lot of the best examples of shared value seem to me to come from emerging markets. They're about the fact that in emerging markets you have lots of institutional voids, you have lots of failures of the market, lots of failures of government. So you need, as a practical, pragmatic issue, to think about value in a very creative way. That's absolutely right. But I think that doesn't mean that that approach to the world is applicable to emerged markets, to rich countries. There's a reason why America doesn't have 3,000 company towns anymore, because we don't need them anymore. We don't need them. There's an infrastructure, there's a market, there's a set of intermediate institutions which have been created. And actually, I think in a lot of what goes on in emerging markets now, as emerging markets become more sophisticated, as they become more competitive, as they create more of an infrastructure, in fact, companies are going to have to be less generous in the way that they define value. They're going to have to think a bit less about shared value and a bit more about shareholder value, a bit more about moving towards the Western capitalist model. So actually, in some ways, this is an idea whose time is passing even as we speak. I'm worried also that the notion of shared value, like the notion of corporate social responsibility, can be a trap. It can be a way in which burdens are imposed upon companies. It can be a way in which incumbents, companies that are doing well, I won't mention GE, but GE is certainly doing very well, say, well, we'll have all these burdens, we'll have all these responsibilities, and we'll universalize it because it means our competitors can't get into this market. And it strikes me that it's very important to remember that value tends to be created by Adam Smith, by the pursuit of self-interest. It's also created by disruptors, people who take an ecosystem, people who take an established way of doing things, people who take a cozy set of relationships and disrupt it. They're rude, they're unpleasant, they're dangerous, but they're also creative, and they create new forms of value. And quite often, if they're thinking about how can we share corporate responsibility, how can we be a better corporate system, they wouldn't do all of these things, and the world would be much poorer for it. When Steve Jobs was starting out what he was doing, he said, It wasn't thinking, how can I be nice to IBM? How can I be nice to Hewlett-Packard? How can I be nice to these incumbents? How can I create a nice ecosystem in Silicon Valley? He's thinking, I have a great idea. I can change the world. I can disrupt this industry. And he did disrupt it, and everybody's life was made better. Some people who are incumbents, life was made a lot more difficult. I wouldn't want to be Hewlett-Packard today. So in many ways, what I'm trying to say, essentially, is that the problems of capitalism, in my opinion, and there are very serious problems, are much more likely to be solved by more capitalism than by less capitalism, by more competition, by more animal spirits, by more innovation rather than less innovation. And just to end up on the GE point, it's absolutely right. And I've been to their medical center in Bangalore, that they're creating these wonderful products, for electrocardiogram products, which are much cheaper than the things that they were producing in the past. They used to be producing electrocardiogram products for $8,000 or $2,000, but they're not doing it because they've embraced shared value. They're doing it because they know that if they don't do it, some other Indian company will start doing it. So it's the forces of competition, not the forces of moral righteousness, which are creating a better world for us all. Thank you.